Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, friends and newcomers to the South Orange Library Special Conversations with Special People. Today we have a very wonderful and special guest, Father Lawrence Frizzell, the director and founder of the Jewish Christian Studies graduate program at Seton Hall University. Father Frizzell first spoke for our library group on November 19th, 1992, on the topic, the spirit of Thanksgiving. And then he spoke in 1997 on the First Crusade. Then in 2006, he spoke on Jews and Christians, Passover, and Holy Week, Easter. And then in 2014, he spoke on two faith experiences of Thanksgiving. And in 2018, he spoke on the Book of Esther, Queen Esther, and the Feast of Purim. And last year, he spoke in 2019 on Passover and Easter and artistic expression. That was last year. And he also spoke on a different topic, his favorite poet, Robert W. Service, poems from the Klondike Gold Rush days. Every time he has spoken, he's been so much, he gives so much inspiration to everyone. And it's a pleasure to have him here. And I thought this is the last week of our programs for this year. And we needed someone uplifting and someone to let us be spiritual and have the faith to know that, God willing, 2021 will be a better year with good health and happiness for all of us and all who we love and the world. So today's talk, Father Frizzell is speaking on interfaith dialogue and collaboration. So it is with great pleasure I introduce our very special guest, Father Lawrence Frizzell.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. And I greet everyone who is listening or sharing with us this afternoon. My focus today will be on how people of different faith backgrounds are able to share and we hope to collaborate in common projects that will touch the community in which we all live. And so when we look back in history, the encounters between people of different faiths have not always been pleasant. And that's tragic in so many ways, and especially for a community that's a minority in a given society. And so we've learned, I hope, to go beyond those situations of confrontation. And we want people to share within the context of their daily life how to make this world a better place. Now, the Second Vatican Council of the Catholic Church from 1962 to 1965 laid the foundations for a deepening appreciation of the Jewish faith among Christians and especially among Catholics, and then how we should be able to also reach out to our neighbors of other faith experiences, other faith backgrounds. So in 1984, the Second Vatican Council work was in place, and the idea of collaboration and working together, learning from each other, was proceeding in various parts of the world. And the organization of the church, which deals with interfaith dialogue, was able to bring together the results of some of the experiences that people have been having over the previous decades. And so in 1984, we have the idea of dialogue in the context of the church's mission to reach out to the world, and to do this with respect and understanding that the people of every faith want to see how their presentation of the mystery of life is going to make a contribution, first of all, for themselves, and then reaching out to others who have particular interest in learning from the people of different backgrounds. So those exchanges between people of faith backgrounds that are quite different will take place often in the marketplace or on the job, in the context of teacher-parent meetings and other situations of daily life. Now, the problems that we've had in the past could be brought back to our memory, and I'll show you an example from my own childhood experience that will help us to understand how not to approach each other when we recognize that we are of different faith backgrounds. So my mother was a school teacher. My father was ill and could not work any longer. So we moved from one place to another, finding a school, 8 grades in one room, with one teacher, no assistants, no electricity, even let alone other things that would make life easier. So we moved to a new town when I was 12 years old. And the neighbors and the other people living in the town soon learned that we were Catholic. And so on a Saturday, when my parents would go shopping and the car would be gone from in front of the house, I would be babysitting, taking care of my younger siblings, and a knock would come to the door. And 2 or 3 people would be there. And they began by telling me that Catholics are going to hell. And there's just no hope for people who don't belong to their faith community. Now, of course, if my mother were there, she would have had a response. But I invited them to come to the church. I said, come and see that we do have a faith experience. But of course, they declined. And this kind of thing then went on from time to time when, especially when my parents were away. Now here we have an example then of a large community where people are sharing their own faith, confronting the stranger, the newcomer, the person of a different background. Now that kind of thing shouldn't happen, of course, in our modern world. We should recognize that we are understanding each other and we can learn from each other. But confrontation and efforts to diminish the other is totally out of place, obviously. Now, what the church has done in 1984 was to sketch areas of dialogue. And the idea of first is a dialogue of life. And then the second is the dialogue of deeds. Third, a dialogue among experts. And then fourth, a dialogue concerning our deepest faith experience in the life of prayer. And we'll touch on each one of these for a few moments in this presentation. So people of different backgrounds are encountering each other, as I've said, and the document that I'm studying with you says, sharing aspects of daily life, people should strive to engage in creative responses to community challenges. And we're all looking, we hope, in our world for justice and for peace. And we have a saying in the Catholic Church, if you want peace, work for justice. And so that's the beginning of the effort to have a positive collaboration among people after people have shared in their daily lives their joys and sorrows, which are very personal to each community group, but can in some way be extended and shared with the neighbors of different backgrounds. And so we share in those kinds of daily activities and special moments in anyone's life. There is the idea of opening up to share with others. And that can be the very joyful time of a wedding, for example, when people are invited among the community members. And then, of course, the funeral and other sad moments of suffering and sickness. This is when the reach of people who are our neighbors can be very much appreciated. Now, as we move from the dialogue of life and for these little informal exchanges that take place among the community members, we have a dialogue of deeds. And so we're trying to work together to improve life within our community. And so this sense of exchange then for the betterment of the community could be developed in the following way. We share aspects of daily life, and then each person is challenged to engage in the fourfold relationship that we have for people of faith. We are related, each one of us, to God, and then we're related to each other. And we have to realize that when we have an interrelational dimension to our life, that we're encountering others, that we live in a community, there is always the reference also to ourself. So we have the challenge in the book of Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. And so we do have to have a certain self-esteem, a certain sense of our own personal dignity, that we're not being trampled on by others, obviously, but we sense that each person's life is precious. Now that within the Jewish and the Christian traditions, that is rooted in the fact that each human being in our faith, each human being is created in the image and likeness of God. And so when we say, love your neighbor as yourself, then of course we realize there's this necessity of recognizing equality within the community. Each member has his or her personal dignity, and there are certain rights that we all have, and corresponding to each right, there is a responsibility. And that's something we have to cultivate within our communities, because in some countries, there's a great emphasis on my rights. But unless we can also draw attention to the responsibilities we have toward each other, then the proclamation of my rights is going to sound a little bit hollow, because we cannot sense that we love our neighbor as ourselves unless we can have that openness to the recognition that we're all made in the same context, the same image. Or now, the other area in which we looked for the fourth dimension is our relationship with the world in which we live, the natural world, the world of other beings which are not human, but animate or living, and then of course the ground, the air, the sea, the soil, the water. All of these aspects of the environment have to be part of our consideration. Now we're trying then to see that life is like a triangle. We're all focused upon our relation with God, and then we're looking at ourself and our neighbor on the bottom side of the triangle. On the left-hand side, we might say, on the right-hand side, it's our relation with the natural world in which we all live and for which we have a certain responsibility. Now, there's often a discussion, of course, for freedom and liberation of people. And this, of course, is a worldwide concern that we are aware that in certain parts of our world at this particular time, as in other periods of history, there are tragic insults, tragic injuries to the sense that each human being is, on the one hand, unique, having a contribution nobody else can make, but each human being is also equal in the presence of God, and we should say in the presence of our neighbor. Now, you notice, of course, within the biblical tradition of Judaism and Christianity, that the four relationships that I've discussed are governed by the commandments. And so we have to recognize that there is within every culture a certain heritage of learning upon which we try to base ourselves. And people then examine their conscience as to how they're living in relation to the faith community in which they've been raised. Now, as we look to this sense of dialogue then in the ordinary world of daily life, we're dealing with the efforts to make our community better. And so I draw attention to the situations where people are learning about the ways in which some exploitation is taking place in different parts of our society. Now, this is obvious in some parts of the world, and we read about it in the newspaper, but also in our own communities. And so the exploitation of the young. You may have read just recently that in the context of the pandemic, children are at home and they're not always being supervised by their parents who may be working from home as well, but sometimes the children are doing things that are quite surprising. So you may have read about the 6-year-old boy who liked to play computer games. And there are certain games which have a cost attached. And so as you want to play a certain game, then you have to pay a certain amount of money to advance to another stage and so on. And within a couple of months, this boy ran up a bill of more than $16,000. And so we want to say parents have to be alerted to the situations of what children can get up to because of inadequate supervision and guidance. It's not so much their fault, but they're being exploited by some people who seem to think that the dollar sign is the key to every success. Now, we want to help people then to overcome situations that lead to these kinds of problems, and there are many more like that, I'm sure, that some of you may have encountered in your own family situations. We're aware sometimes of certain customs within our culture that we could reach out and help the newcomer to our town or the same street or whatever. We could try to help these people to recognize what's going on. So many years ago, I would be going to a set of apartment buildings in the area where I live. And one day I knew that there was a new family coming from a far off country. And they had arrived on October 31st. And so the next day I came to visit them and I found they were terrorized. They had just left a refugee camp where there was not very much security. they came to this apartment block, and they'd settle in for the evening, when suddenly there came a ringing of the doorbell, and then a lot of shouting, trick or treat. And then they found that they didn't know how to answer because they didn't know the language. And so they could hear smashing on the door. And of course, when I came, there were egg yolks all over the door. And so here the people had thought they were coming to a land of peace and tranquility. Then their first experience is one which would happen only once a year. And fortunately, they weren't clued in to what to do under these circumstances. And so there are little ways in which we can help the newcomer to fit into our community. And then we can try to find ways in which we can all work for the betterment of the environment in which we live. The physical environment of the streets and the parks and so on, which are in need of certain cleaning up every once in a while. And one of the areas that people could collaborate among faiths is, of course, the care of cemeteries. That in some cities, cemeteries are being neglected, and there's some cemeteries have been used just by people who don't have a good intention, but have a place to hang out, as it were. And so we can work together, we hope, to improve a situation of showing respect for those who have died and are buried in a given place. Now, when we come to the question of dialogue, the third form is the dialogue which is going to replace the unsavory confrontations of the past, polemics and arguments, which people were sometimes forced to listen to. And now we want to realize that, yes, we indeed should share with each other. And ordinary people are doing this, as I mentioned, in many different settings of their daily life. But there's also the necessity of the exchange among experts, where people who are specialized with certain knowledge of the given traditions, their own tradition and that of other groups, where we can try to learn from each other. And this means that sometimes there are speakers called in to a given community, addressing the people of varied faith backgrounds. And then there's also the possibility of scholarly exchanges, which take place on university campuses and other settings among people who want to share with each other, review the history of the past, and tell their own story and the way in which people have progressed in terms of development of their own faith and cultural community, but how that has had impact on others would be understood in a new way, possibly, when we present our history, our story, in the context of other people of different backgrounds, and maybe in some cases people whose background had involved confrontation, and especially the minority communities being able to understand, and then we be assured that this kind of interaction, which was often on a very unfair, uneven playing ground, as we might say, this would not be taking place in our modern world of a certain sensitivity to the basic dignity of each person and the way in which we can grow in understanding. And so we are going to then try to think about the ways in which we can learn and maybe have a sharing of faith experiences in the contemporary situation, and then going back in history, seeing how community lived in different parts of the world, possibly, but lived in situations where there were sometimes grave, grave lack of consideration and trials and difficulties imposed by a majority community of a different faith background. Now, besides this development of exchanges which would take place so that people can deepen their understanding of their own faith and the relation their heritage has to the world around them, and how this world around them may indeed have people of other backgrounds who would be able to share certain things that may be of interest, and the sensitivity that each community develops toward the other will be a background for some common projects which could enhance the appreciation that the entire community at large would have of all its components. Now, the fourth area of dialogue is the sharing of the spiritual values and principles that emerge from a life of prayer. That is, we can learn from each other in the way in which our traditions of worship and prayer resound deeply in our own personal lives, in the life of a given community. And then we want to look at the way in which each community deriving its strength from a spiritual context of their own setting, that they'll be able to appreciate what others are doing. And people of a deep spiritual background can indeed learn from each other that the ways in which we pray indeed it would have distinctive components, but there would be also the possibility of certain commonalities, certain things that we could see that resonate in more than one community. And so, so this is the challenge that we faced in the 1960s in a special way in Western communities, both Jewish and Christian, was that some young people of that time were dissatisfied with the very secular developments within society, and especially with the idea of the sciences being supreme, that just gave us a little time, the scientists would say, certain people would have such a self-confidence that we'll solve all the world's problems, all the medical and health problems and so on will be certainly under control within a rather short time, some people thought. Now, some young people thought that that's very superficial, and so they went off to Eastern religions to find what we could call a mystical or a very deeply spiritual context for grappling with some of the world's problems. And the irony was that these young people had not been taught that within the Western traditions of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, there are deep rivers, we could call them, deep sources of spiritual strength. And so people can learn about their own heritage at the same time as they may be exploring some religious or spiritual context that's very different from their own, can seem to be resolving certain problems. And of course, at a very deep level, some of these challenges are already being faced in the history of the given traditions in which these people belong. And so they could have a deeper understanding of their own heritage and then go into a dialogue with people of other backgrounds. So those are the areas in which we want to say that a new set of insights for the exchange that people inevitably will have in their daily lives, that the way in which we can approach things is that, yes, I have my convictions. Each one of us can have a very, very profound understanding of his or her religious and spiritual heritage, and indeed want to share that with others, but have the exchange in a way that will be open-ended to both sides of a community sharing, and that the minority group need not be fearful or apprehensive that they're always being shouted at or they're being told of their inadequacies, with the possibility of looking into the total picture of each community's life, maybe not being available to all those concerned. So here we are, we're asking for an attitude in sharing with each other that will be sensitive, that will be appreciative of the principles that we share in common, and then we search out what we do share, and then we try to deepen that experience of faith as we move it into action in our daily lives. Now, the ideal would be for each community and all its members to say, we want to be the best we can. We want to shine forth with the values and the principles that are governing our lives. And indeed, that should have an impact on the society in which we live. And then if we can share with others and learn from them, and then have eyes opened to the common projects that we could engage in to make our local community a better place, and then to extend that to the nation and the world around us. And so, so there are so many good things in our heritage, in our religious and spiritual background. There are so many tragedies and difficulties and trials in the world around us that indeed we want to bring the best of who we are to engage, in the sense that, yes, people want freedom. People have to develop an insight into the fact that some people, even in our own communities, may not be free. There are young people, children especially, who are being trapped in situations of enslavement that can be going on even under our own eyes, as it were, let alone in other parts of the world. And so it's for these young people, especially, that we want to reach out and help them to improve their own possibilities of education, and then open them up to the possibilities of finding a way to express their sense of who I am and what I am going to do in the world, with the sense of freedom that will allow them to grow in their possibilities to exercise a responsible response to the problems and the challenges of life. So I would be happy to share with you in terms of your experience, and have you give some insights from your background, And if there are any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them.
Father Frizzell, you were wonderful as usual.
Oh, thank you.
And can I ask the first question?
Of course.
Where, I always do, I'm sorry. Where were you raised? In what town? In what state? And
Oh,
the fact that you're so ecumenical, that you began, the Judeo-Christian studies in the Catholic University, the first one. What made you, how did you find this
well,
call?
I must say that although I was one of the founding members of the master's program in Jewish Christian Studies, I came here only in 1974, and my predecessor, Monsignor John Österreicher, came in 1953, and he founded the Institute of Judeo-Christian Studies. So he is the one who laid the foundation for this work. I was born in Calgary, Alberta, and but when I was a child, because of my father's failing health, we moved a lot, and so we were always living in rather remote places, far from the large cities, and places for the most part without electricity, without modern conveniences. So it was, compared with the people who grew up in Jersey City, I had an experience which was more of a pioneer experience in terms of many of you and your background. So I grew up with the context of a Catholic community of faith, my own family, very often in the context of several other Protestant communities, but I'd only met one Jewish shop owner in the town where I went to high school when I was away from my family. Other than that, I hadn't met people of the Jewish community until I went to Israel in 1964. I went to study Hebrew in an immigrant school in Jerusalem. And so that was the beginning of my contact with the Jewish community. And of course, this immigrant school had people from many different parts of the world. And so that was the setting in which I came to appreciate the vitality of the Jewish community and the variety of cultures from which these people had come to Israel.
Thank you for, thank
you. Father Frizzell, I wanted to
Yes.
have a comment and maybe a question.
Okay.
In the earlier part of your talk, you mentioned something from the Bible that we've all heard about, loving thy neighbor as we love ourselves. And it's been my observation that maybe what gets in the way sometimes of loving our neighbor is that I've observed that some people really don't love themselves to begin with. And they maybe they have a bad feeling about themselves, so it might be, harder for them to be empathetic to others. And I was wondering if that's something that is just, my personal observation, or is there, something that gets in the way of reaching out to the other? I mean, for some people.
Well, I think it's a very good point. And so when I mentioned love your neighbor as yourself from the book of Leviticus in chapter 19, verse 18, the question, of course, relates to our personal self-definition, we might say. And that's why I referred back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 28, where God created the human being in the divine image and likeness, and then gave responsibilities as agents or stewards of the world in which we live. Now, so that very important text then lies in the background for people of the Jewish and Christian faith experience. Now, I think you've hit upon one of the major problems that some people have in our society, or in the world at large, we could say, that they don't have a sense of their personal dignity. That's the point you made, because they were crushed or hurt or whatever, and whoever knows the variety of possibilities of abuse, and then they had a very low sense of self-esteem, and then that's projected, as you say, upon their relationships. One of the worst situations I came across years ago was in the area of New York and also in Jersey City. There were many people who had come from Vietnam and were working hard to make their life here in the United States. And some of the young people who were here, sometimes because they were children of a US soldier with a Vietnamese woman, and these young people had been ostracized in their own society as they were growing up, and they were not given any sense of their own dignity. And then they came to this country, and unfortunately there were some older people who began to control them, and they formed a group called Born to Kill. And so this was a terrible tragedy that people whose infancy and childhood had in Vietnam had led them to a sense that they didn't belong anywhere. And then they came to this country and they still didn't belong. And they weren't, in some cases, welcomed, adopted, and so on into families that would be constructive. And so the boys that I knew in one family, the two boys who joined this group were both killed by the time they were 16. And so you have hit upon a very important point, that if people aren't given a sense of their own dignity, then they're not going to respect anybody else, unfortunately. They're going to feel at odds with the society, and then there's always an adult who is reaching these people and then bring them into a kind of a counter society, we might say. A gang is the more current term, so that these people are destructive of their own lives and of other people's lives. And so indeed, we want to have people realize that a sense of one's own personal dignity is the foundation for the way in which we're going to draw strength to cope with the trials of life, and then we hope have a constructive relationship with those around us. But so much depends on adults. The way in which we are engaging our community with the larger world around us. So I thank you. Yes, that's a very important point. And how people can sense their own dignity and personal responsibility for making a contribution to this world, that's inherent, I think, to the challenge that we face when we see disruptive society or disruptive actions within a society.
Thank you.
That was very thoughtful. That's perceptive.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Shall I go on?
Yes.
My thoughts on this, where our current situation, how to reach at some point, as the 4 years we've just all experienced drew to a close, it became harder and harder, and then maybe more impossible or too hurtful to try to communicate to people who have become President Trump's supporters. And I worry about this because it seems like there's no communication and no way to communicate. And I'm hoping that we can come together, and I think we will to some extent. But some of us have lost good friends, or at least not been able to communicate with them because they have continued along the path of not caring about other people at all.
Yeah.
So,
well, as a Canadian, I don't express too much of an opinion in regard to the political scene in this country, but I would say that situation whereby a society doesn't welcome the newcomer, that situation is, to me, very tragic, very unfortunate, because no matter what our background is, almost all of us were newcomers at one time, or our grandparents or great-grandparents were, and so the fact that maybe they weren't well treated by the society at large should be a lesson from which we can learn that we don't do to other people what we don't like happening to us. And so that as you know, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do to you, that's the positive form, or the negative form is do not do unto others as you wouldn't like people to do to you. That should be another way of articulating a principle that is virtually universal among world religions. So I would draw attention to that, where I realize that the reference to the commandments may seem to be, of course, the Jewish and then the Christian perception of how to live. We do find the equivalent to what we call the social commandments. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, and so on. The not bearing false witness, all of those social commandments then have their place within virtually every other culture and religious tradition as well. But the expression of the golden rule is virtually universal. All the major religions and philosophies of East and West, North and South, have a version of that principle. So that's an important point to keep in mind, that whatever political background people may have, we would hope that they would say, yes, I'd like to treat the newcomer with a certain sense of welcome and openness to helping that person, just as my ancestors were helped by others. And if they weren't helped, then let's make this world a little better in our time.
I have a question.
Yes.
Father, as you spoke earlier about the transformation or changes that took place in the 60s and 70s with regard to young people
Yes.
and embracing different kinds of religious faiths that were not necessarily Western based, but were more Eastern based. I am a person of deep faith and have been my entire life. And in looking at our religious landscape across the country now, it seems as though every denomination is not really appealing to young people. And given that, I don't see young people necessarily turning to Eastern religions. I see young people turning away from religion altogether. And if that has been your experience and what you've observed as well, to what are our young people turning? How do we turn them back? And what will it take to make a change to a society where we have other generations that have a deep abiding faith in any religious belief? And as you say, all religious beliefs have undertones that are very, very similar with which how we are to treat other people. How do we make that restoration in our society so that for generations to come, we have people, young, middle, and old, who believe that that's an important tenet in our society overall?
Sure. Well, you've hit upon an important point that now a number of people within, as you say, the younger age group are called nones, N-O-N-E, none. What religion do you belong to? None. And that some of these young people apparently also say, I'm not religious in terms of a religious commitment, but I'm spiritual. And so they do sense the need to recognize that there's something more to life than the daily fulfillment of my need for food and clothing and shelter. So there's, I think, those of us who are committed to a religious heritage recognize that this is an enormous challenge when the number of people of the younger age group who say, I don't belong to any of the religious traditions. It is the question for us, where did we fail? Where did we not project the attitude that indeed there are certain fundamental principles of life that are extremely important to have things in the right order. So you've hit upon a challenging question for which I don't think I have all the answers, that's for sure. But we're aware in meetings of
something with you.
Meetings of Jewish and Christian organizations that I belong to, we've certainly been concerned with this for, I'd say, almost for at least a decade now, when the what do we call those services, that the polls, when the polls on religious questions have turned up an increasing number of people who don't see themselves as belonging to any one religious tradition. But it's good that they have a sense that, yes, the spiritual order is important. And we think, those of us who have our commitments, that the heritage of hundreds and thousands of years is something that gives us a foundation for grappling with current issues. Yes, indeed, the challenges are numerous. The modern questions are profound, but human nature hasn't changed. We're we're not that much different from what we were generations ago. But the challenges that come upon us through the world of technology, the world of science, medicine, and so on, these challenges and these benefits certainly have increased enormously.
We were pretty good looking when we were not bad looking.
I think whoever's Ragnar, I think you need to mute your phone.
Yeah, we hear you mumbling in the background.
Thank you.
Okay, I have another question. It's kind of building on what Myra asked, and about how we actually, well, not just Myra, but and also the prior speaker as well, how we actually grapple with the concept of self-esteem and self-value, self-worth. And you talked about the fact that people need to find, an essence of themselves and value in themselves to be able to treat other people in a respectful way. It's very difficult to exude that from within if it's not within you to an external environment, society, world. Though as not just a society locally or a society, nationally, but a world society, I think we have been engaging in.
Excuse me, Tracy. Whoever Ragnar is, you have to mute your phone.
Hello?
Sandy, yeah, you have to mute.
People
All
are
right, Tracy.
answering questions and it's annoying to have that background. Oh, it's mute now, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so given the fact that from a world perspective, it seems as though we are becoming more denigration oriented as societies and putting other people down, attacking each other in very vile and destructive ways. How do we, as a society, make societal changes that makes that not acceptable, such that we are focused on developing generations that will have excellent self-worth, value, sense of community responsibility, which comes along with self-esteem, community responsibility, not just for themselves and not just for their immediate families, but for everyone who they come in contact with in this world. What do we need to do, those of us who are here now, to make those adjustments, to look at our societal ills in a real introspective way and understand to what extent we can modify our behavior or be socially active to change the way in which people are treating each other now?
Yeah, I think one of the points I would make is that each person should have a filter through which he or she projects one's own first reactions and so on, and then continuing reactions to what's going on in our society. In other words, in the Jewish tradition, the tongue is considered to be one of the most important of our instruments of who we are. And what we say, and even before what we do, can have either very uplifting effects or can be devastating, of course. And I wonder sometimes when we have this world of immediate interaction and the possibility of sharing almost globally, we might say, if we don't have that sense of a filter to ask ourselves, and in the old days we used to say, count to 10 before you react to something. Remember,
Yeah.
we used to suggest that in especially in situations that would be confrontation, that we would watch what we say and how we say it, with tone of voice and everything like that. So I think that this would be a beginning. How is that taught? That certain sensitivity to how we are perceived when we articulate a position or make a point and so on. So this is, I think it's a complicated task. It's a challenge that I think you've hit upon. It's very important, along with the idea of having our sense of self-esteem, personal self-esteem, but also recognizing that we all share the same fundamental gift of life, and therefore it's not as if there's one community that's higher than another, worth more, and so on, and to bring about a world of justice leading to a deep shalom, a deep sense of peace as a community experience of well-being and wholeness and sharing. Those are the dimensions of that word shalom that we like to emphasize, not just absence of conflict, which might be the definition of peace for some people. But unless we go a step further and try to have that healing and positive use of our tongue and our reactions to things that go on around us, then we're going to be struggling enormously with with certain deficiencies, we might say. So that,
We need people like you
oh
all
well,
over, because you have given us such a gift today.
oh well, thank you.
Father Frizzell, it doesn't matter what religion, you have so much to offer. And unfortunately, we don't have enough leaders who are saying and doing exactly how you have treated people all through the years.
Oh, well, thank
That
you.
is why I loved having you, and I can't wait for your next discussion on whatever you like. I hope you'll come back in the spring. And thank you so much for your efforts all through the years.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Well,
I
I
wish
appreciate,
all of you good health and happiness and a happy.
thank you.
Happy
And
New Year. Happy New
we
Year.
wish, yeah, we wish everyone to be able to come through this time of restrictions and trials. We hope and pray that this will be behind us. And I keep hoping that it will be a unique experience, that some of you will be able to tell your grandchildren that this happened only once in 100 years. So God bless you, and thanks for having me again.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you, and I wish all of you all good health and happiness. And
Thank
thank
you.
you, Father Frizzell.
You're
You're
welcome.
wonderful.
Yeah, God bless you.